esteemed resident coordinators, colleagues from the savannas of the southern African region to the beautiful wildlife of East Africa, down to the rainforests of the Central African region and to the golden sands of North Africa. The abundance of Africa's environmental goods and services are visible to each and everyone, what is referred to as natural capital. But the continent, as we know, is also the world's largest arable land holder, second largest continent, holding this 65% of uncultivated arable land, and at the same time, 10% of internal renewable freshwaters. And it doesn't only end there. The total value added of Africa's fisheries, as well as aquaculture, is estimated at $24 billion US. And in addition to this is employing over 12 million people in the continent and providing over 200 million opportunities. And that doesn't only end there. This abundance is also with Africa's forests covering over 675 million hectares, which contributes to over $17 billion US each and every year, both in wood products and over $5 billion in non-wood products. And these all together, esteemed resident coordinators, colleagues, Africa also have abundance not only in solar energy that is estimated to have a potential of 10 terawatts, but also have abundant hydro estimated at 350 gigawatts and wind estimated at 110 gigawatts, as well as geothermal over 15 gigawatts. And specific to all these, it is also estimated that 0.3% of the sunshine that is received in the Sahara region of the African continent can light the entire Europe. Distinguished colleagues, esteemed resident coordinators, together with this beautiful scenery and balanced weather, these environmental resources stand out as the primary source of livelihoods in the entire African continent today. When you talk of 62% of Africa's rural population depending directly on the health of these local ecosystems and their services for survival, which is the highest in any continent in the entire globe. When you talk of natural capital, derivatives up to about 72% of total exports in the entire African continent, and 42% of government revenues are actually generated from this natural capital that the continent harbors. However, over time, the unsustainable practices in the use of environmental resources for socio-economic gains in the continent has given rise to significant environmental challenges, which in turn threatens not just the realization of the Sustainable Development Goal, but also the future of the entire continent. From environmental crimes in the form of illegal logging, to fishing, to pollution, to land degradation, Africa's environmental challenges are costly. And the fact that they're costly doesn't only end, they also have transboundary implications. Degradation, distinguished colleagues, costs the continent each and every year $65 billion US. This literally means over 15 million US getting down the drain each and every day. And this is the second highest for any region globally. The continent also recording a very high level of losing forest cover at a rate that is higher than the global average. 6 of the top 10 countries losing the most tropical primary rainforests in the entire African continent. The challenges moves from land degradation to air pollution, which in the entire African continent today is causing more premature deaths than unsafe water, than sanitation, than malnutrition and unsafe sanitation. Up to about 712,000 people are killed each and every year as a result of air pollution, from air pollution resulting in an over $400 billion US per year in cost. And poor sanitation affects the environment by polluting land, fresh water, and marine resources. And on top of this is also chemical pollution, which is a major challenge in the entire African continent. The annual cost of lead exposure in the entire African continent is about 134.7 billion, which is almost equivalent to 4.03% of the entire GDP of the continent. And then E-West, US is another source of pollution that is now among the fastest growing types of waste in the entire world. Each year, up to 50 million tons of US is generated globally, and it's estimated that 80% of all US destined for recycling in developed countries ends up in informal US recycling sites in developing countries, primarily so in the African continent. Heavy metals and other hazardous substances find their ways into rivers that contaminate grand rivers, as well as also pollute and cause public health risk. And then there is illegal wildlife. As you can see on these infographics here, is still another critical environmental challenge. Elephant poaching alone is estimated to cost the African continent between 3.6 to 6 billion in lost natural capital and 25 million in tourism revenue each and every year. Africa has lost over 100,000 elephants in just 10 years. And considering that an elephant is worth over 1.6 million over its lifetime, it is therefore safe to say that Africa has lost up to about 160 billion in just 10 years. And these are revenues that are getting down the drain. Extreme resident coordinators, illegal logging is also an issue, and yet a critical environmental challenge that is facing the continent. Between 50 to 90% of timber in certain African countries is harvested and traded illegally. And cumulatively, illegal logging costs the continent up to about 17 billion US dollars each and every year. And then on top of that, there's illegal fishing, still another costly environmental challenge that is costing the African continent 3 billion each and every year. And overall, when you put all of these in perspective, illegal logging, from air pollution, land degradation, and natural capital mismanagement, to fisheries, to wildlife, timber, minerals, and also illicit trade, illicit financial flows. All these put together, the continent is losing beyond 195 billion annually through all these. Distinguished colleagues, these challenges are not happening in isolation, from land degradation to illegal logging, environmental crime. All these are not happening in isolation. They're happening in a continent that is actually facing malnutrition. They're happening in a continent that is also suffering amidst other socioeconomic burdens that is pushing the continent far from attaining the Sustainable Development Goals. The food insecurity scenario in the continent continues to worsen. Child malnutrition and the resulting stunting costs for the continent is 25 billion each and every year. And despite this dire need, 1/3 of all the food that is produced in Africa is lost as a result of lack of value addition, and the list goes on. But these also present opportunities that the continent can then be able to seize, to be able to address not just the ballooning youthful population, where each and every year 12 million of these youth are getting into the labor market, and only to compete with 3 million jobs. That means that literally every month the continent is supposed to be creating 1 million jobs. And amidst these environmental challenges, the question then is, where will these jobs come from? At the expense of the environment or not? But there are opportunities, and these opportunities that environment as a solution presents. For example, beating pollution will mean recouping over 400 billion US dollars annually, a cause that will not only be able to contribute to attain the Sustainable Development Goals, but also investing in air quality, monitoring systems, better fuel quality standards, as well as clean cooking solutions are key timely interventions that can be leveraged on. We're also talking about effective legal regimes, policies, and institutional frameworks on the environment that are essential for mitigating or preventing the threatening environmental problems which emanate from the quest for socio-economic development, enhancing sustainable capacity of the enforcement sector, judiciary, inspections, customs, and prosecutions, as well as academia. But practical results from the ground are also showing that substantive economic opportunities do exist that can be appropriately designed for sustainable management of natural resources. It is actually problematic, not just because the continent is already vulnerable from the socio-economic perspective, but it is problematic in that even when a sample of 30 countries were actually sampled, over 60% of them are warming faster than the entire globe in a continent that have socio-economic challenges already. And the trend is projected to continue in the coming decades. And the report reaffirmed this, the IPCC report. This is an issue, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. It is an issue because what drives the disproportionate vulnerability of the continent is answered by an insightful African proverb that wood already touched by fire is not hard to set alight. What this means is that challenges always take advantage of weak points. And Africa is already having weak points, and weak points of weak socio-economic trends. And the prevailing low levels of socio-economic development in the continent is what is exacerbating this disproportionate vulnerability of the continent. And while climate change is global, the poor are disproportionately vulnerable to its effects because they lack the resources to quickly recover from the shocks. And if you take just a simple example, North America is experiencing Category 5 cyclones, and they experience so quite regularly. But they don't experience the level of damage that, for example, Mozambique did experience during the recent cyclone Idai. The message for the continent is therefore very clear that the effects of climate change must align with accelerating socio-economic growth to build resilience. And this then calls for increased ambition. The United Nations Environment Programme flagship report on what is called the Emissions Gap Report sent a unanimous message in its 2018 flagship report to the challenges in 2 words: increased ambition. The latest IPCC report reaffirmed that on global warming was unanimous on the need to increase ambition, noting that climate action ambition needs to be increased 3 to 5 times the current commitment to be able to safeguard Africa's development and the entire world. But Africa as a continent have shown leadership. Esteemed resident colleagues, ROD's colleagues, Africa has shown leadership because I'm speaking today. 50 of the 54 African countries have ratified the Paris Climate Change Agreement. And this ratification is over 90% rate, potentially the highest in the entire globe. That is what the figures are showing from the UNFCCC submission link. This means that over 90% of African countries have turned their intentions into reality, into measurable, into accountable commitment on climate change. But while this is applaudable, even more notable is the composition of these commitments. They demonstrate the continent's prioritization of accelerated socio-economic development, focusing on what Africa has got in abundance. But what we know is that despite the fact that there has been this ratification, turning these realities, into concrete actions, is summarized by an African proverb that good millet is known at the harvest. This African proverb reminds us that the great promise of Africa's leadership in ratifying the nationally determined contributions will remain unrealistic or unrealized unless we take concrete steps in its implementation, because we know that it takes a village to raise a child, and it will take the efforts of the entire UN system to be able to ensure that its noble aspirations of Africa's ratifying their NDCs and adopting the Agenda 2030, as well as the Sustainable Development Goals, can be implemented. Extreme ROCs, what we also know is that in February of this year, 2019, the joint UN approach was fronted by the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, which identified 3 core objectives, which one is accelerating current nationally determined contributions implementation, 2, strengthening development of more ambitious next generations NDCs, and lastly, mobilizing non-state actors, especially civil society, to contribute to climate action, and called for it from the government. And under each of these objectives, the work that the UN Environment has been doing with sister UN agencies in countries aligned to 5 specific areas, which is driving nationally determined contributions implementation through leveraging on what Africa has got in abundance, what is called Africa's catalytic sectors. sectors that Africa hold a global comparative advantage in and which provide the shortest route towards achieving the sustainable development goals, as well as ensuring creation of income and enterprise opportunities, especially for the youth. And there is the agricultural sector and the clean energy, where Africa have 365 days of sunshine in addition to wind, in addition to geothermal, and constitute 70% of all the NDCs that countries put in place. Supporting these countries, for example, in Cameroon, amalgamating and using clean energy to be able to showcase that you can actually be able to leverage on the sun, which the continent have an advantage for it, for 365 days, can actually be able to dry cassava. And drying this cassava has actually helped supported up to 500 women for the first time, who have now started adding value to the cassava. They are now drying the cassava to increase its life shell and minimize post-harvest losses. This is contributing not only to enhancing food security, which contribute to goal 2, but at the same time also ensuring that household poverty can be combated, contributing to goal 1. And through this drying and milling, cassava spoilage has been reduced by up to 30%, thus enhancing resource efficiency, contributing to goal 12. And for example, in Cote d'Ivoire and the Democratic Republic of Congo, practical demonstration of converting agricultural waste in rice fields into biofertilizers and fuel briquettes have actually not only helped in reducing emissions, but is creating opportunities and jobs, especially for the youth. And the second strand is, as was highlighted by the ROCs and also by our RODs and executive director this morning, policy is the biggest driver of change, but at the same time, policy implementation in silos is actually the biggest operational risk. Therefore, policy coherence and harmonization to bridge the NDC's implementation become quite very important. What we know is that the Ministry of Environment in countries is actually the responsible ministry that reports on the nationally determined contributions. But the NDCs cut across the Ministry of Environment. You have the Ministry of Agriculture, the Ministry of Energy, Lands, Transport, Trade, among key others. And therefore, synchronizing and harmonizing these policies become quite very, very important. And this is actually the kind of work that UNEP is doing with sister UN agencies, working with member states and non-state actors to be able to create. For example, in Nigeria, harmonizing the policies and working with the Ministry of Environment, Ministry of Agriculture, the Standard Organization of Nigeria, facilitating this interagency policy task force is convening not only the excellent policy that they have called the Nigeria Feed in Tariff Regulations, but also the iconic cassava bread policy, which bringing these together is helping them to drive not only value addition in the cassava value chain, but at the same time realizing multiple SDGs and implementation of NDCs. In Benin, implementation of energy, agriculture, finance and cooperatives, industry, trade ministries policies to ensure a coherent set of incentives are actually being synchronized, and the list goes on in other countries. And the fourth stream is, despite the fact that policy is the biggest driver of change, how do we ensure that we can be able to settle for optimal policy decisions under the changing climate? How do we know which policy is crucial to be able to ensure maximum socioeconomic and environmental dividends? And here takes us to these technical tools to be able to bridge the policy gaps, as well as science policy gaps to drive implementation of the NDCs. And this, in collaboration with UN agencies and countries, decision support tools are put in place to be able not only to create an opportunity to invest, but also to invest where the dividend and return on investment can be high as emissions are also abated. For example, in Mozambique, a tool has been developed where Mozambique, it shows that the country will sequestrate up to about 70% more carbon by combining improved agroforestry techniques with solar power irrigation relative to the business as usual approach of expanding conventional fossil power irrigation and slice and burn. And the list goes on in Ghana, in the DRC, in Cameroon, where similar models are showing where investments in the entire 5 agroecological zones of the country can actually not only help create 5 million extra jobs, but at the same time abate emissions. And the fourth one, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, esteemed RCs, is astronomical amounts to implement the nationally determined contributions. These astronomical amounts are actually elaborated in the United Nations Economic Commission estimates, which shows that the total investment required for implementation of the ratified nationally determined contributions across the entire African continent, including both conditional and unconditional, will exceed $2.5 trillion US. And actualizing these alongside the Sustainable Development Goals, where reports have shown that each and every year the African continent needs to spend 1.2 trillion annually, bringing this figure to about 3.7 trillion, means that we need astronomical amounts of money to be able to drive the realization of not just climate action, but at the same time implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. But as we're speaking today, the official development assistance has peaked at about 40 billion, which is actually 20 billion less than what each and every country needs if you were to divide equally among the 54 African countries. The 3.7 trillion US is needed to drive climate action and implement the Sustainable Development Goals. So the big question then is, how will we raise these astronomical amounts, given that even within the UN family itself, the entire UN-wide annual core budget is slightly over just 5 billion US. And this calls, therefore, for innovative financing to drive the NDCs, from leapfrogging from traditional financing and supporting the establishment of structures of innovative market-driven approaches. And this is happening at a time when the African continent is spending already, contributing already 20% of its total current annual adaptation needs, estimated at 15 billion. This means that Africa is spending each and every year 3 billion of adaptation cost to finance their local adaptation needs. But instead of asking how can we raise the 80%, the question we should then ask, how can we invest the 20% we have to maximize returns? How can we ensure that the benefit of the 20% in hand go beyond traditional environmental approaches, but ensure that social, economic dividends and environmental opportunities are created to drive the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. And this is why working with countries in collaboration with UN agencies, actually leveraging on already existing established approaches, like, for example, in Nigeria, leveraging on the risk-sharing facility to bring in environmental dimension, the ecosystem-based adaptation for that, as well as clean energy. It's already happening. And the last aspect is partnerships, innovations, and incentivizing the youth. Esteemed ROCs, as you already know, the African continent is over 60% youthful. This means that this is the biggest constituent for the entire African continent when it comes to climate actions and driving of the Sustainable Development Goals implementation. Section 5 of the Paris Climate Change Agreement talks about bringing state and non-state actors. Goal 17 of the Sustainable Development Goals talks about inclusive partnerships. It therefore means that bringing state and non-state actors becomes quite very crucial in driving climate action and inspiring youth so that they can be able to see climate change as an opportunity, as well as environmental challenges as an opportunity, can actually pay a dividend. Across the continent, there are already youth who have been inspired to take climate action, coming up with innovations, utilizing information communication technology to connect farmers to markets, to connect them to access solar clean energy. These examples do exist, and how to bring them to the fore is now the challenge that we face. But what we know is that this African proverb, which tells us that the bridge is repaired only when someone falls into the water. The bridge is repaired only when someone falls into the water. Considering the high vulnerability that Africa faces today, its low economic base and the NDCs and SDGs financing gap, standing at about 3.7 trillion US dollars, the environmental losses, 195 billion US dollars, tells us that no one agency of the UN can do it alone, and the need for a collaborative approach is upon us. Thank you.